This program, while curated to help you improve your health, contains general advice and should not replace the individual advice of your medical practitioner.
Experts say non-communicable diseases, those that do not spread from person to person, are the leading killer today.
Chronic diseases are responsible for more than 35 million deaths every year.
What worries us in particular about this year's report is that some key risk factors that are driving up preventable chronic illness are getting worse.
World Health Organization is calling for urgent action to address an increase in chronic diseases and mental health disorders.
In life, it's normal to have ups and downs. But what do we do when we get stuck? I've always been fascinated by the health journey. Why do some people get better while others fail to make the shift? In Season 1 of The Shift, we explore the fascinating field of gut health and help you discover what is really going on with your digestion, microbiome and health.
The gut is amazing.
Changes our concept of the human body, become useless to the healthcare system.
We're always shifting. Your genes are shifting, your microbes are shifting, everything is shifting.
I'm Katherine Maslen, and this is The Shift. If there's one thing for sure, we are all getting sicker. Chronic disease is on the rise. A chronic disease is defined broadly as something that persists longer than a year and needs ongoing treatment or support, or something that affects the way you live your life day to day, or both. Examples are diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's, asthma, epilepsy, arthritis, autoimmune disease, tooth decay, chronic sinus, obesity, mental health issues like depression and bipolar, to name a few. Another way that chronic disease is defined is by calling it a non-communicable disease, or NCD. That is a disease which is non-infective or non-communicable, so anything outside of an infection that is more than short-term is classed as an NCD. I know we have listeners from all over the world, but let me give you some stats to give you a perspective of just how big this problem is. Cardiovascular disease causes the most deaths, followed by cancer, respiratory disease and diabetes. NCDs are largely caused by diet and lifestyle factors, many of which we talk about in The Shift. Chronic disease accounts for 71% of all deaths globally. In Australia, 90% of deaths are due to chronic disease, and 1/3 of the population has at least one chronic lifelong illness. In the UK, chronic disease accounts for 85% of all deaths. In a study in 2018, it was found that 54% of people over 65 years of age had 2 or more chronic diseases. According to the CDC, in the US, 6 out of 10 Americans have a chronic disease, and 75% of deaths are due to chronic illness. People who die of chronic disease lose on average 1/3 of their living years. 1/3 of your life could be lost by a disease which is completely preventable. Think of that. Rodney Dieterdt has been a professor of immunotoxicology at Cornell University for over 30 years and is one of my all-time favourite humans. He's been looking at the environment and the microbiome and its role in chronic disease for decades. Rodney is also the author of the book The Human Superorganism, where he demonstrates the role of our microbiome in the development of disease worldwide. I asked Rodney about the rise in chronic disease that we're seeing.
I have to say, one of my bones to pick with what we have called chronic diseases or non-communicable diseases is that we don't cure them, largely. We manage. We know that one non-communicable disease, or NCD, they're abbreviated, begets others as you age. You can expect, when you get to my age, in the 60s, to have 2 or 3. And there are always medications that are medically coded with those diseases, so you're adding medications. And they all have side effects, so you're adding risk of side effects every time you do that. And you become dependent on these. So, all you have to do is ask the question, for patients prescribed statins, what is the physician's plan to remove them from statins?
And they don't have one.
No, that's not a good pattern.
I
think I was 4 when I started getting asthma, and it was severe very quickly. So I spent most years of my childhood, I had time in hospital. I remember always needing blood tests done and lung x-rays and antibiotics and steroids to get me well. I think I was in hospital 40 times in those 5 to 6 years, and that was just hospitalisation, not outpatient visits to hospital or doctor's surgeries.
This is Ellie, one of our shift members that had a very long history of immune dysfunction. As you heard above, she was in hospital 40 times over 5 years, which is just astounding. I also wanted to know how many rounds of antibiotics that she'd had throughout her life.
It would have to be in excess of 50 rounds of antibiotics. I know that the medication was causing inflammation. I always looked puffy, and it also caused a lot of skin issues.
I interviewed Ellie for this series because the focus on her treatment, once we settled down those initial symptoms, was working on microbiome restoration. Ellie had been in the conventional medical system since she was 4 years old, which was fantastic and in fact life-saving during her asthma flare-ups. However, the recurrent treatment of steroids and antibiotics left her gut in a much worse position. We'll check in on Ellie later in the episode. Let's get back to my conversation with Rodney. So you have this pattern where people get one NCD and then they're put on a drug, and they get another NCD and they're put on another drug, or they're put on another drug because of the side effect of one of their drugs. How has this happened?
Well, it's happened because, and again, I'm not saying that everybody's been irresponsible, but everybody has been like a thoroughbred horse with blinders on. So it's all narrow context. So a physician sees a patient and they're presenting symptoms. There's something to be dealt with, and the physician will react to those symptoms. So a child may get antibiotics, or a child is treated for asthma, or a child, and the physician has probably been unaware of the comorbidities associated with that condition. So in the book, The Human Superorganism, I talk about the 32 comorbidities of obesity. Childhood obesity is epidemic in the US and several other countries. And if we do nothing different than we've been doing, there are very predictable 32 or more diseases that are in that group of children going to be at higher prevalence than the normal population. So the question is, why aren't we stopping that? Why would we tolerate that? Now, again, we may not have known that in the 1990s or in 2000 or, we weren't aware, but we certainly are now. I'm not the only one to be writing on this. So we need to treat for lifetime planning, not today's symptom. And that is where we can change the culture. And that's where naturopaths and all healthcare providers have an incredibly useful role to play, because, as you know, diet and everything else goes into diet can affect medication effectiveness, in addition to microbiome metabolism. So we need to be treating across a lifetime, which means if you've got a child diagnosed with asthma, as a pediatrician, and I've had pediatricians throw up their hands and say, wow, it's almost too late once I diagnose asthma in a child. And in a sense, it is for invitation to joining the NCD cohort. But now there's a chance to manage that child differently. It's not just inhalers and what you're doing to manage symptoms of asthma. It's avoiding predictable sets of diseases to which that group is going to experience more of. And it doesn't mean an individual child has to have these different comorbidities, but the pattern of what we've been doing has led to these things showing up at an unacceptable high rate. And again, all it means is you get another doctor's visit, you're dependent on another medication, and you may be doing that for life. So I can tell you, I've had family members that have double-digit numbers of medications per day, and you finally get to where the side effects are overwhelming. They're almost worse than nothing.
And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people that are listening to this thinking, that happened to me. I got diagnosed with this, and then I was put on this drug, and then this, and then this, or they'll know somebody who's followed that pattern. It's really rare that you don't know someone really close to you that has at least a couple of these NCDs.
Absolutely. Just look at the explosion in allergic diseases and obesity, and you'll see.
Largely, the cause of these NCDs are due to lifestyle factors such as poor diet, excessive stress, lack of movement and smoking. And as it so happens, all of these factors can also impact our microbiome health, further adding to the disease burden. I want to point out the disparity here. We are so technologically advanced that we literally have an entire computer in our phone. We know more about the human body than we ever have before. Modern medicine is apparently more advanced than ever. We even have bionic hands and feet that function almost like the real thing. So if we're so smart, how are we so sick? The burden of chronic disease we have is not just high, but steadily increasing. Are we really such a superior race if we live out our lives with chronic, intractable diseases? So how does this chronic disease happen, and what is the role of our gut in it all? Is there something we can do to turn this around? Because if we look at how we're doing right now, I'd say we're fast on our way to becoming the weakest species. We're going to explore this more throughout the episode. Dr. Leo Galland is an integrative medical doctor with over 30 years' experience. He's also the author of The Allergy Solution, so I thought he'd be a great person to ask about the epidemic increases in allergies that we're seeing.
The concept of seasonal hay fever, seasonal allergic rhinitis, that is not mentioned in any ancient textbooks of medicine. It first appears in the 19th century in England. And it's observed that it's more likely to occur in people who live near cities than in farmers. And the frequency of hay fever, seasonal allergic rhinitis is the medical term, just steadily increased through the 19th century. In the US, it was still considered pretty rare up until the 20th century. And then it just started to explode. And it is clearly linked to air pollution. Industrial air pollution is part of the process, but automotive air pollution greatly increased that.
Worldwide, allergic rhinitis or hay fever affects 10 to 30% of the population. Over 40% of the world's populations have elevations of IgE antibodies, which is a marker showing that we're sensitive to certain proteins in the environment. And as Dr. Leo mentioned, this is a new disease. It was unheard of before the 19th century and continued to be rare for most of the 20th century. I think the most alarming thing is the steady increase in the amount of severe allergy that's occurring. In the last decade, in Australia, the US and the UK, hospital admissions for severe allergic reactions have doubled. More alarming still, in children under 4, the increase in hospital admissions from anaphylactic allergy have increased by 5 times. In an anaphylactic reaction, the airway can become quickly restricted. It is highly life-threatening and not something that you want to happen to you. If we continue on this upward trend, it won't be long before nearly every human is highly allergic to common things in our environment. These are all numbers, but how does it play out in the real world? Rodney Dietrich had an interesting point of view.
I have an exercise I used to do where I talked about seat selection on an airline. I'll do this in some of the public lectures. And you realize that you can get incompatibility in terms of passengers, where you have service animals and you have dog allergic people, where you have people that are celiac, and you have others that are diabetic. And Mayo Clinic, at least at one point, was suggesting that diabetic patients carry peanut products to boost their blood sugar. Well, that doesn't, that may not help your seatmate. You know, that could be a life-threatening experience. And then we have fragrances. And so you have a heavily perfumed individual and a fragrance allergic individual. I think I discussed in the book the fact that we have fragrances that have used formulas for over 150 years, you know. I don't want to mention specific brands, but, you know, there's some that, you know, the Chanel line, you know, they've been out there a long time. And they haven't changed their formulas radically, but they've been forced by the EU to change them because of the number of people that are allergic to components. So we've changed. They haven't changed. We've changed. That should be an absolute red flag that we're not managing prevention and therapeutic health well.
Next up, we're going to release the Expert Series, featuring more in-depth conversations with our 24 experts. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a thing.
The Shift!
How are we going to coexist as humans with all of these concurrent allergies? Already, there are so many of us that suffer from food intolerances that we have to deal with. But it's very different because with allergy, it can be life or death.
It's hard to remember now because I don't get a lot of these symptoms anymore. I had the asthma, trouble breathing through my nose. I had a niggly pain in my heel all the time and in my knees when I was running. I had muscle twitches, the psoriasis type skin condition, the acne on my chest, acne on my face. I was feeling really tired, struggling to get out of bed, not feeling rested when I was waking up. And I was also sneezing a lot in the morning and basically having an allergic reaction to dairy.
That was patient Ellie again. Ellie had 59 different symptoms when she came to see me just 12 months ago. After working on her whole health, adjusting her diet and supporting her healing process with natural treatments, Ellie now only has to deal with 2 or 3 of these, which are also slowly on the mend. Her asthma is still there and it's something she'll always have to look out for, but it is much more manageable and the treatment is minimal. My hope for Ellie is that by continuing to look after herself, she can avoid further NCDs and live her life symptom-free. How does your immune system actually work? As author of the Autoimmune Fix, I knew that Tom O'Brien would be able to break it down really well.
Your immune system is the armed forces in your body. It's the Army, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard. It's there to protect you. So when your immune system says, you got a problem, it's not a dysfunctional immune system. And unfortunately, many of our researchers have referred to the immune system when you've got elevated antibodies as saying the immune system's dysfunctional. Let's shut down the immune system. No, no, no. In the majority of cases, the immune system is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, trying to protect you. So the question is, what's it trying to protect you from? If you've got rheumatoid arthritis, what is your immune system trying to protect you from? And so just go on Google and type in rheumatoid arthritis and Proteus, Proteus, or rheumatoid arthritis and Klebsiella, Klebsiella. Here come the studies that show you sometimes when your body is fighting a bacteria called Proteus, you're going to make antibodies to your joints and you get rheumatoid. Or when your body is making antibodies to Klebsiella pneumoniae, which gives you pneumonia and recurrent sinus infections and breathing difficulties, your body sometimes is going to make antibodies to the collagen of your joints and you get rheumatoid arthritis. When you got a rheumatoid arthritis, there's a reason why your immune system is making antibodies to your joints. There's a reason. Now, you don't want to just shut down the immune system. If you take meds to help with the symptoms for a while, that's fine. That's wearing a life jacket. That's fine. But you don't stop there. You take the meds so you feel better, you can function, but then you have to identify, why is my body inflamed? And go after what the immune system is saying you've got a problem with.
Tell me about the gut and autoimmune disease.
I can't say every, but I can say most autoimmune diseases have 5 components to development of autoimmune disease. The genetic vulnerability, Professor Yehuda Schoenfeld will speak to world-class immunologist, speaks to the genetic vulnerability to autoimmune diseases. It's a prerequisite. Next is the environmental trigger. It's a prerequisite. Next is intestinal permeability. The gateway opens up. These macromolecules get through from the environment. So genetics, environmental exposures, a breach of the intestinal membrane, so these environmental exposures get into the bloodstream, activating an immune response, and all of that control of oral tolerance for intestinal permeability is determined to a major part, we're learning more about this all the time now, by the microbiome. So those 5 components. So any practitioner that is wanting to really dial down and understand the mechanisms of how autoimmune disease develops needs to become familiar with all 5 components.
Do you think autoimmune disease can be reversed by addressing these 5 components?
Oh, absolutely. We see it all the time. And I'm not sure I can use the word reversed, but certainly put into remission. We have seen many, many different autoimmune conditions where the antibodies that are causing the autoimmune condition come down to normal. The symptoms disappear. The tissue rebuilds and regenerates. Sometimes, now if you've got advanced rheumatoid arthritis and your joints are all deformed, in my experience, you're not going to change the deformation of the joints, but the inflammation dissipates, so the pain dissipates.
Autoimmune disease is also on the rise. In 2017, 1 in 12 Americans had at least one autoimmune condition. And if you look at women only, that figure is 1 in 9. Other statistics were harder to find, but when you look at individual autoimmune conditions, they are all on the rise. There are now over 80 known autoimmune diseases. Some of the most common include systemic lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, psoriasis, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, Sjogren's syndrome, type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, and of course, celiac disease. Once you have one autoimmune disease, you're much more likely to develop a second one. In autoimmune disease, there's an attack on the self. Organs and tissue become inflamed and damaged, and there can be very severe consequences of this. For example, in type 1 diabetes, the pancreas becomes severely damaged and the body can't make insulin anymore. In psoriasis, it's the skin under attack, and in Hashimoto's, the thyroid. I mentioned that women have a higher incidence of autoimmune disease. This is the case for many other conditions like mood disorders and cardiovascular disease too. I asked integrative gynecologist Dr. Felice Gersh why women were more at risk of disease.
Women and men are really incredibly different. Women have very different immune systems. We have more B cells. We make more antibodies. We have more dendritic cells. Those are the cells that communicate between the innate and the adaptive immune system. So they're like the interface between the immune cells that are the first responders to an infection or an invader, and then they communicate to the cells that make antibodies that are more specific in terms of how they fight infection. And women have more of those. Women have more immune cells in general, and they respond more rapidly. So they're like more sensitive. So female mast cells, for example, which are the immune cells of the body, what are called the first responders, innate immune cells, they are packed with preformed inflammatory contents. So they're like explode on contact. They're like grenades or mines that are lining all of our interfaces between our bodies and the outside world. Women's mast cells explode more readily than men's. That's why women are more prone to allergies, to hives, and so on. Of course, men can get these things too. Women are more prone. Women are dramatically more at risk for autoimmune diseases. For example, like 80%. Now, we now know a whole new way of looking at autoimmune disease, because the whole word should be changed, because autoimmune is wrong. It makes it sound like our immune system is confused and it's attacking ourselves. It is not attacking ourselves. What the immune system is doing in so-called autoimmune disease is attacking invaders, like viruses and bacteria. And women, like you were inferring, women are better at fighting off invaders. They are much better. So women, for example, if there's an epidemic of something, we'll say a flu epidemic or some other kind of epidemic, the plague, women are more likely to survive than men. And it's all about survival of the species. So if you have a situation where 10 women survive to every male, guess what? That can work. That's a busy guy with the 10 women, but they can replace the population. If you have a situation where you have 10 men survive and 1 woman, good luck, we're goners, she can't replace the population. So nature wants women to survive, to repopulate if there's, a plague or some kind of epidemic. Women are way more likely to survive an infection. So now we understand autoimmune disease. Women's immune system fight infections better than men. But now we have a world of chronic infections because all our barriers are broken. They're all leaky. Pick any barrier, they're all leaky. And these invaders, these hordes of viruses and bacteria and parasites and fungus and all, they're coming into our body by the droves. Our immune systems are not able to get rid of them. It's just the numbers are overwhelming. We can't handle it. So we end up in a state of chronic infection. In the old days, we would just often die. When you had an overwhelming infection, you died. Now, it's really a strange new situation where we have a low-grade chronic infection. The immune system is endlessly battling this infection. And it turns out, and this is very new discoveries just in the last several years, that RNA and DNA of viruses and bacteria are incredibly similar to the RNA and DNA of humans, that it's the same. We have almost all the same sequences. It's unbelievable. So the bacteria and the virus are really the target. Our cells are caught in the crossfire. So it's not a case of mistaken identity at all. The immune system is doing what it's designed to do, which is fight infection. It's just that it's doing it chronically. Normally, we're designed for acute infections. You either live or die. Now we have a brand new state of chronic infection, and the immune system is just doing what it's supposed to do. It's trying to kill, and our cells are just similar. So it's not mistaken identity. It's just that there's such an overlap, and we were never designed for chronic infections. We weren't designed, that cancer, for example, is a modern disease. We weren't designed for cancer either. So there's a whole bunch of things that our bodies really were never evolved for, but now they're just living with it, like chronic infections. So our whole view of what autoimmunity is really needs to change. It's pretty much it's a sign of a chronic infection, and we need to look for what's causing that infection. And that's not happening in the conventional medical world. The rheumatologists are not understanding this. I don't know why. There's tons of wonderful research published on PubMed, showing that the whole theory of autoimmunity was wrong.
Reviews help us know that we're hitting the mark with what you need and help us to shape future seasons. I'd really appreciate it if you could take a few moments to leave us a review. I would love to know what you think.
The Shift!
It has been known for autoimmune disease to be up to 3 times more common than it was 30 years ago. We don't know exactly why, but there is some very strong evidence to suggest that it's due to the massive increase in environmental toxins and also the health of our gut, where over 80% of our immune system resides. I asked Dr. Tom O'Brien why he thought we were experiencing such an explosion of autoimmunity.
Oh, there's no question about the numbers. And the answer is complicated. There are many contributing factors, but the overall category of the contributing factors is the environmental toxicity. Whoever's listening to this right now, wherever you're sitting, is there carpet on the floor? You're smelling formaldehyde. Are there ceiling tiles? There are phthalates in the air that you're breathing. We can't smell this stuff, but it's everywhere. Are you sitting in an old house right now? There's lead in the paint. And so there's little lead in the air that you're breathing from the windows going up and down and little flakes of paint that are in the corners, and let alone the food, the chemicals, the insecticides, the pesticides in the food. So the whole category is the world we're living in is exposing us to so many toxins, your immune system trying to protect you. This is not an immune system that goes haywire. Autoimmune mechanisms are triggered by environmental exposures. There's a trilogy to this. There's 5. It's not a trilogy anymore. Dr. Fasano has announced that it's 5, and I think he's absolutely right. There's a genetic vulnerability. There's an environmental exposure, and the one we know without any question is celiac disease. The genes are HLA DQ2 and DQ8. The environmental exposure is gluten. But why is it that 30% of the population carries HLA DQ2, DQ8, but only 1% gets celiac disease? So it's not the genes that cause the disease. The genes say you're vulnerable to the disease. You pull at a chain, it always breaks at the weakest link. It's at one end, the middle, the other end, your heart, your brain, your liver, your gut. Wherever your weakest link is, that's what your genes determine. But you have to be pulling on the chain. So eating wheat pulls on the chain. That's the environmental trigger for those people. But it's not enough, because everybody eats wheat, and 30% of the population has the genes. So what else is there? There is a loss of integrity of the epithelial barrier of the gut. Slang term is intestinal permeability or leaky gut. There is activation of immune response trying to protect you. And there's the microbiome and the contribution of a dysbiotic microbiome that sets us up for an immune system trying to protect us from the environmental triggers.
Ailey Cohen is an integrative rheumatologist and environmental medicine specialist from New York. She knows a lot about environmental toxicity, and I wanted to know what she thought about the increases in chronic disease.
I know people in their 30s and 40s with breast cancer. And I know, lots of young people getting thyroid cancer, it's unheard of, and it's now becoming almost epidemic now. So when we start to think about people getting sicker, high rates of autism, I'm from New Jersey. We have the highest rate of autism in the country. It's now 1 in 34 based on CDC statistics. Nationally, it's 1 in 51 boys. One of the highest rates of breast cancer is in New Jersey as well. So time is of issue, and people are getting sicker. They're living longer, but they're living sicker, and I think that's a real important issue.
Why do you think in New Jersey there's so much illness and there's these higher rates of things like autism and breast cancer?
Statistically, in terms of just the amount of contamination that we have in the state of New Jersey. So New Jersey has the highest number of Superfund sites in the country. Second is California, and third is Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania's butted up right against New Jersey. And when you think about the number of Superfund sites, which are contaminated, government designated toxic sites where nothing can be built because of the level of contamination, whether it's from residual farming and pesticide, from regulations like DDT and some of the chemicals that were arsenic that had been used back in the 50s and 60s. So those are designated areas where they must be cleaned about, I believe it's about 3 feet of soil must be removed before anything, and has to be repetitively tested before anything can be built on that site. We also have brown sites, which are not quite as, so to speak, toxic as Superfund sites, but certainly are up there. And so we have the highest number. And so when we think about what gets into our water, what gets into our, we're the garden state. We grow a lot of vegetables and produce, and it's not always organic. So we have to think about just sort of the soil we're growing our food in, perhaps. We have to think about the water that's flowing through the piping through the state of New Jersey. There can be breaks along any plastic piping. We have to think about the air quality. We have to think about behavioral habits. Are there a greater number of smokers? Is there greater obesity? Is there less, physical activity in schools, in New Jersey schools? These all things, they have to be broken down and to really make an assessment on this issue. But certainly New Jersey is one of the most toxic states in the country and really should be looked at more carefully.
So what did you call it? A
Superfund site? Superfund site. We now have, I believe, 114 Superfund sites in the state of New Jersey.
So what determines that it's a Superfund site?
Essentially that there's enough chemicals within the soil that it poses a health risk to those who may actually work or live there.
How do they end up cleaning them up out of the environment?
So some of these Superfund sites, not all of them, of course they have to dig out about 3 feet, I believe, of soil and kind of actually remove it. But there's also this process of remediation where they actually dump into these sites bacteria, like probiotics, particularly lactobacillus, which has been actually known to absorb, these little bugs have been able to absorb heavy metals. And so they actually will dump into these Superfund sites, probiotic species, and they will absorb into these cells the heavy metals, and then they can remove them in the soil as well. So the connection between what we're doing to our soil and what we should be doing to our gut is very interesting, because when we take in probiotics or probiotic foods or prebiotic foods, which actually really help feed the zoo in our gut, so to speak, we are also potentially taking away some of those exposures as well, such as the heavy metal exposures, lead from drinking water, food contaminants and those kind of things.
This is sort of new to me. Like, it makes sense that you can only dump a certain amount of chemicals into an environment before it reaches capacity. But the fact that these places exist is that acknowledgement that these chemicals are bad, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you remember water flows underneath the ground. And so because these chemicals aren't contained in any kind of way, we are looking at, chemicals that really are washing through the underbelly of the state. I am not an expert in this area, but I know enough to know that when you have contaminated soil, it potentially could lead to contaminated water. And what does water do? It evaporates into the air, and we can have contaminated, it could also be roadways. It could also be, again, lifestyle. But when the environmental aspect is not taking into account when it comes to the numbers we're seeing epidemiologically in terms of endocrine-related cancers, thyroid cancers, which are often related to chemicals like thiocyanate, nitrate, and perchlorate. These are from produce. These are from things that are grown in the soil. We really need to take a harder look at some of these numbers.
While there's a lot of research emerging about environmental toxins, sometimes it can be difficult to prove that it harms our health when the exposure's at very low levels over a long period of time. I asked Ailey what the challenges were with research to show the effects that toxins have on our health.
Yeah, excellent question. So, we know that really whether or not you develop a disease or an illness really depends on several things. It's not just an exposure and how long or what that exposure is. That's one aspect. But it's also your lifestyle and it's also your genetics. There's really this dance between your genetic makeup, your lifestyle, which includes diet, exercise, stress, childhood trauma, all the way through to exposures. So, not every one of us is going to, wake up with a disease and may have had the same exposure to the same fertilizer out back in their yard or what have you. But the idea is that we know through animal testing and human studies now, we really do know. We have enough information. The World Health Organization does a report that is literally 4 inches thick on endocrine disrupting chemicals. We know the American Academy of Pediatrics has put out a report and a statement, I should say. The Endocrine Society, the obstetricians and gynecologists groups such as ACOG, we're all banded together, at least from the medical societies, to show that there's enough data here to show exposures really matter and that we have to pay particular attention during vulnerable periods of development, which include the in utero exposure period, pregnant moms, through little kids, and how they are on the ground and kind of touching a lot of these chemicals on the floor and dust. Teenage years, again, because of the endocrine disruption risk and all of the hormone surges, even through menopause. We don't often think about menopause, but that's a very big time for humans, for women to have hormone changes, which makes them particularly vulnerable to some of these changes. So I think that that's just a really important thing to know, is that there is consensus amongst major bodies in the medical world and among bench researchers and major health institutions, and that we have to think about the fact that causation is not always the same as association. We don't always have a cause and effect, but using this precautionary principle, which we're using, which basically says even if the evidence is not there, that if it can reduce harm and it can likely cause harm, then we should stop that behavior or that exposure. That's called the precautionary principle, which is really used worldwide at this point.
Yeah, so prevention.
Coming
back to at the start of the conversation, what you said about that there's all these different chemicals, but there's no process of saying, hey, is this safe first? It's like, well, let's just put this into the market and then see what the consequences are 10 or 15 years later. What do you think needs to change legislation-wise so that we're protected from these new chemicals?
Well, I think what's going on amongst the people that do this best, which is, advocacy groups and the people who are fighting the good fight on Capitol Hill, is that there's so many different areas, but one of the top ones is really to make sure that these chemicals are tested in a reasonable way by the appropriate people, not just industry people and manufacturers who voluntarily give some information to the public, and to the government, but really done correctly. And we have a very good infrastructure to do so. It's changing. Politically wise, we're seeing not a good change in terms of some of the oversight, in terms of environmental oversight, for chemical spills, chemical, air pollution. But, we do have appropriate testing that should be required for all industrial chemicals before they are put into products. I mean, we now have over 42 million pounds of synthetic chemicals that come into the country every day. We have 1,000 new chemicals at least every year that are coming onto the market. There are 15 new patents per week in this country of new chemicals that are not undergoing any testing for neurotoxicity, developmental risk in pregnancy, cognitive development in children, any of these parameters. And only 5 chemicals in the United States has ever been taken off the market since 1976. In Europe, we have over 1,100 chemicals that have been taken off the market or not allowed to be used. But in this country, only 5. And I think that's pretty remarkable, these numbers.
It's insane, really, when you think about it. And this is the thing, it's not any one chemical often, it's this sort of conglomeration. I did find a research paper on menopause. I did some presentations on it a little while ago, and I can't remember the specific chemicals, but it was definitely phthalates, definitely flame retardants were in there, but it showed there were 5 or 6 different endocrine disrupting chemicals that would put women into menopause up to 7 years earlier than they were meant to be, which means then they lose that 7 years of protective effects against estrogen and all kinds of things. So there's definitely, and there was, I think, 40,000 women in this study. So
no, it's very interesting. And on the other end of things, we're seeing young girls going through, their menstruation is starting, many, years earlier than it did decades ago. Even 2 decades ago, it used to be that women, young girls got their periods at the ages of 15 and 16, and now we're at as low as 8, 9, and 10. And that's a real risk for breast cancer from estrogen exposure over a lifetime. So, you're seeing at different, ends of the spectrum of development that these endocrine chemicals can really have a whole host of effects. And so that has to be brought out, to the public.
let's take a bit of a breather here because that was a lot to digest. The subject of environmental toxicity can sometimes be quite depressing, but the good news is that there's a lot that we can control. To begin with, look at eating organic wherever you can. Filter your drinking water to ensure that you're not getting toxins in that way. Essentially, we need to get back to nature as much as possible, avoiding synthetic chemicals and fragrances, and using natural products around the home and on our bodies. That's a wrap for part 1 of this episode. In part 2, we're going to explore the links between our microbiome and chronic disease, the decline in fertility, and much, much more.
Coming up on The Shift.
And all of a sudden, the inflammation goes down, and many of those people were pregnant shortly thereafter.
We talk about how important our lifestyle choices are today.
They knew that fertility was a sign of health. We seem to have forgotten that.
We now know that the microbiome of the father is evident in newborns. That
the menstrual cycle is a vital sign of female health.
That you and I, looking at each other right now, recognize that by and large, it's a preventable situation.
I hope you're loving the information in The Shift as much as I do. But maybe you're thinking, what do I need to do for me? Take our online assessment to discover what your gut is up to. Go to theshiftclinic.com/quiz.
The Shift!
This series is produced by Must Amplify. Hosted by Katherine Maslen. Executive producer Ronsley Vaz. Music and sound design by Shade Furlong. Thank you to all of our experts. For more details on them, go to theshiftclinic.com/gut.
Still listening? Season 2 of The Shift is currently in production and it is going to be huge. In Season 2, we turn our attention to moods and emotions. Mental health issues are massive and there is going to be so much that we cover. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out.
The Shift!
Thank you for listening.
Every listen or download of this show
and hence this voice
directly funds the ending of sex
and human trafficking.
A voice for a voice.
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 Find out more at
Amplify
Amplify
Impacts.com.
Impact.com.